Hello, everyone. So today we're going to do things a little differently. Maybe it'll feel a lot different. Just wanted to kind of spend a little time um, talking about narrative structure, which is what we're planning to focus on in class today. And um, I'd already invited you to take some time before watching this recorded lecture, to think through the questions in your own right. I specifically invited you to think through those in a very personal, non-technical way, because I think that's where stories really resonate and really matter, is at that personal level. Some of what I say may sound or feel more technical than that, and I think that's kind of the nature of things, but I did want to kind of interact around that and more kind of a gut level to begin with. So here are the questions. You should have already looked at those, but I'll just kind of share screen for a moment and let you see. These are the, nope, I'm Zoom. Where is that? Well, yeah, there are the questions. You can see those. How would you define a story? What is a story? We talk about it all the time. I think we all sort of know at an intuitive level what it is. And I think that there's a quote I'm trying to remember, and I won't be able to get the source, but I'm paraphrasing. We may not be able to define it, but we know it when we see it. And I think that that's a very appropriate way to engage with stories. But I also think that there is some value as we're in this process together of trying to create stories, of actually thinking more precisely, more articulately about what we mean when we talk about stories and narratives and plots. So I don't want to get too far in the weeds of that, but I just wanted to mention that from the beginning. And then the other thing that I gave you to consider is a worksheet that looks like, I'm having trouble with my sharing today. Let me stop that and see if I can. Yeah, worksheet that looks like this. And that's just to kind of give you something to structure the talk a little bit, and also to make this a little more interactive, or maybe that's just the illusion of interactive. But you do have some blanks, and you can kind of fill those in as you go along here today. So that will that'll kind of guide our conversation. But all that is fairly abstract, as you'll see. So I really want to land this in the context of specific stories. And as I mentioned last time, we're going to be looking at three narratives in particular, primarily The Hunter's Wife by Anthony Doerr, which I asked you to read. Also, I mentioned, if you get a chance to rewatch the movie Shrek, I'll be referring to that, and also the stories from Luke 15, particularly the parable of the Prodigal Son, which is how we've come to know it. All three of those kind of triangulate and give us some good sort of very specific and concrete things we can look at and examine and hopefully learn from as we consider what it means to build our own stories out of words. So here's where we go. If you're just kind of trucking along with the worksheet, you can fill in those first few blanks. It says there, at any given time, as individual societies and cultures, humans will be involved in consuming, creating, and consisting of stories. And so that's the idea, is that I don't really like the word consuming. Maybe I should say connecting through. I was trying to make it be all C's. But consuming, we listen to stories, we take them in all sorts of forms. I know we've talked about this before, but it's worth repeating. Creating stories, whether you ever sit down to write a story, you tell stories, you share stories about what's happened to you, what's going on. And the idea that we consist of stories, that our lives, in a very literal sense, consist of the stories we inhabit and participate in from day to day. And we'll kind of dig into that as we go on. This reminds us that humans tend to locate or center our identities within the context of larger narratives. So that's worth thinking about. It's not super central to what we're talking about, but it's worth thinking about. I say there, including but not limited to the biblical story of creation, fall, and redemption or restoration and renewal. That's even if you're not particularly religious or spiritual in a traditional Orthodox sense. I think in the Western world, that's a central and dominant narrative that we all live by to one degree or another. Those stories of redemption, stories of renewal really appeal to us. Even stories that aren't necessarily rooted in any explicit or, again, Orthodox Christian teaching. I think to give one very contemporary example, the Marvel series that kind of culminates in, Infinity Wars / Endgame, where you have that idea of a renewal, a resurrection, where people who've been eliminated come back. And so again, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit trail today. That's more philosophical, but it's worth thinking about. I'm going to kind of skip to the bottom of the page there and just give you my functional working definition of story, which I asked you to kind of think about your own at the beginning of the discussion forum. So here goes. A story begins with an unstable situation, follows an active character through an emotionally charged sequence of events which change him or her in some important way. So that's the basic idea. A story begins with an unstable situation, follows an active character through an emotionally charged series of events which change him or her in some important way. As you look at just the first major component of that, the unstable situation, you see that for a story to be a story, what initiates it is often, almost always, some sort of destabilizing incident, I would say. And this can happen from outside a character, like a character being acted upon by another character or a force of nature or some other circumstance, but it can also well up from within a character, just a feeling of unrest or dissatisfaction with life, or a feeling of having outgrown a place. Those are a few examples of how that can work. That creates this sense of instability or disequilibrium or unrest in the central character. So if you look at The Hunter's Wife, for example, I could just kind of geek out on this story for hours, and I will spare you, but I think it is really worth kind of considering what Anthony Doerr is doing in this story that makes it so powerful and works so well. So in the first thing we can say about this story is that it inhabits two distinct time zones. So in the first scene, we see the hunter on an airplane, and he's flying into Chicago, and we know from what the narrator tells us that it's his first time leaving Montana, which is just a very intriguing thing, right? Why would he leave a place that he's always inhabited? So all these sort of narrative questions begin to brew right off the bat, and we're not given a lot of explicit information about that. We kind of have to read the story and follow the thread right through to the end to find out exactly what has brought him to this moment in time, this scene in Chicago. So you have that scene, which is in terms of the span of time, it's fairly short. He, a few hours in this evening from the time the plane is landing to kind of through this dinner that he goes to. But then the second time zone, I think this is where the real sort of meat of the story is. He goes, the narrator, the story drops into this deeper time, and recounts a story that actually takes quite a few years, takes us through several years. I don't know exactly what it is, maybe 10 years in the hunter's life, and also as his story kind of overlaps with and interweaves with Mary Roberts, who becomes eventually his wife, as you saw in the story. Those two stories kind of intersecting and overlapping, and in some ways clashing and colliding. So again, I think the unstable situation in the sort of first time zone of the story, which is that what we'll call the narrative present, is that he's just sort of leaving home for the first time, leaving his Montana home with all of that's familiar to him, and going out into this very unfamiliar and what he describes as uncertain and unsafe kind of environment. The next aspect of that definition says it follows an active character. I think that's one of the most important things, and one of the things that, I'll just say that a lot of us writers tend to be observers, and we tend to be more passive by nature. So often it's hard for us to identify what activates a character. So again, that's just something to think about and something to really pay attention to as you read. Look at what writers like Anthony Doerr are doing so successfully in the context of the story. And then we'll come back to the emotional charge. Bit of that, I think that's a different way of thinking about stories, what's important to the characters, and what we are being made to care about as we read or interact with the story in whatever form it's coming to us. Again, the sequence of events, that's just the idea that things are happening, things have to happen. And if we had more time, or if we were willing to take more time, we could just go through and really trace out a full outline of the hunter's wife and say, X happens, and then X happens, and then X happens. And to look at how those events tend to escalate or intensify over the course of the narrative. And I'm scrolling down on the screen share, and I've given you a separate sheet that has this check mark in a slightly enlarged form, what I'll call the inverted check mark. You've probably at some point heard of Freytag's triangle, and this is kind of a modified version of that, where you have, roughly speaking, if you can see where I am here, you have this beginning here where it's kind of a flat line. This is sort of the establishment of what's going on in the world, and then the sort of what I've referred to as the inciting incident, or the incident that kind of destabilizes the character. So we have that unstable situation. Again, in The Hunter's Wife, you have this situation where he's on an airplane. It's not super dramatic what's going on, but it does raise a lot of questions for us. And then as the story moves into what I'll call the sort of backstory, or the foundational story, the sort of earlier time zone of the story, where you have the hunter meeting his wife in Great Falls. I'm on page 3. That actually is much more dramatic, much more, there's a lot more overt conflict. And again, just in terms of event, a lot more is happening in that time zone, and there's a lot more movement across time as well. So in a sense, we can look at this as we can trace both the story of him coming to Chicago and feeling really unsettled and unstable in that environment, and kind of working through that and becoming increasingly uncomfortable as one form of this sort of narrative structure. And then we can look at that backstory, or that the other sort of storyline, although they're totally related, and one actually kind of culminates in the other as a separate story that we could trace out along this map, and look at sort of the initial inciting event, which is when he sees Mary Roberts, the magician's assistant, for the first time. And something about that encounter creates this disequilibrium where the character has presumably been fairly satisfied and content with his life prior to that moment. And then all of a sudden, there's something that he wants and can't initially have because of the obstacles and impediments that stand between him and getting that thing. And what's both a metaphor and a literal reality in this story, the idea of the hunt, the pursuit of the desired thing, is what kind of leads to all of this rising action. So let me back up there and just look at a couple of other things that I've got on this handout. According to E.M. Forster, who's, if you've never heard the name, he's a novelist and wrote really with great clarity about what makes novels work and why we love them. He has a book called Aspects of the Novel where he really sort of lays a lot of this out. E.M. Forster argues in that book that there are only two types of stories. One, a stranger comes to town. Two, a person embarks on a journey. A person takes a trip. So in the first, you see that the stranger, and this can be a literal human stranger, or it can be an event, something that comes in from the outside. The stranger can be a storm. It can be a new idea. It can be, in other types of fiction, aliens invading Earth. But a stranger comes to town. Something happens that creates a sense of unrest from a previously stable, for a previously stable community or individual or family or culture. In the second, a person embarks on a journey. This is usually, something's happening within the character that creates this unrest, and the person sort of embarks on a journey. One way to think about this is that they are really the same story from different points of view, and we'll get to point of view a little later in the course. That from the stranger's perspective, if you look at it from the community's perspective, it's a stranger comes to town. From the stranger's perspective, the stranger is the person, the character embarking on the journey for whatever reason or whatever complex of reasons. So that's kind of a good sort of frame. And again, you can see in The Hunter's Wife, in that first time zone of the story, the hunter is a character embarking on a journey. In the second layer of the story, which is really this more substantive layer, I think, Mary Roberts' appearance in the town is kind of a stranger comes to town. She comes into his world and again creates this very unstable situation. So according to Aristotle, a character is his or her desire. That's the next blank. And John Gardner kind of discusses the same idea in his book, The Art of Fiction. Yeah, The Art of Fiction. He says that what we're looking at is what a character wants and wants intensely. So we'll kind of toggle back and forth between those two ideas, desire and what a character wants and wants intensely. I think it's fair to say that, that like in the situation with the hunter's wife, again, for example, in the opening scene, in the Chicago scene, we're not really sure what the hunter wants, what he's sort of longing for, what his desire is in this scene, but I think you kind of have this felt sense, this sort of you just sort of feel that he's longing for something, that he has this deep desire, and ultimately, as you know, that is to understand and reconnect with his estranged wife, but that doesn't come in until a little later in the story. Of course, in the second time zone of the story, it's much more clear, much more explicit. What he wants and wants intensely is to connect with Mary Roberts in a meaningful way. And again, there's some troubling language in there as he thinks about that in terms of hunting, because that's all he knows. And so one of the things that fascinates me about this story, and I think really makes it super powerful, is that while all that's going on, we're very much aware as the story unfolds that Mary has her own story. And so it's actually one of the questions I often ask about this story for purposes of discussion is, whose story is this, or who is the protagonist of this story? And of course, because the hunter is the first character we meet and we kind of follow him, we get a lot more access to his interior life. Many readers tend to think that it's his story, that he's the protagonist. And I think you could make a strong argument for that. But if you think about the title, it's not called The Hunter or The Hunter's Story. It's called The Hunter's Wife. So why did Doerr use that label for his story? Why did he center our attention on that? Is maybe because she's the one who has the most at stake or the most to lose. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you where I land on that. In fact, I think you could definitely make a case either way. But as those two stories unfold, again, kind of parallel or often kind of interweaving together, Mary's story and the hunter's story, you see a real conflict of desires, that he wants and wants intensely one thing or set of things, and what she wants is, as the story unfolds, quite different, and those actually become increasingly at odds with one another. And that points back to something we were talking about last week, which is this idea, to borrow Keats' language, of the negative capability, which is from the perspective of the artist. Again, this isn't like about literary criticism, but about literary creation, about what we can learn about how the story is made, how it works. And that's the idea that Keats introduced as being one way of understanding Shakespeare's genius, and I would argue it's a way of understanding Anthony Doerr's genius as well, that you see simultaneously two very different characters with very different desires unfolding, and the story doesn't necessarily sway your sympathy or your empathy one way or the other. You're allowed to kind of hold those two stories in tension as the story unfolds. And to me, that's really a brilliant thing, and something that I think we could all learn from. So one way to think about this, if you want to sort of fly at 30,000 feet here, is that whatever the specific object or goal, any desire will fall into one of two categories. So the hunter wants to be in a, say, relationship with Mary Roberts. That's a very particular desire. In a more abstract sense, her appearance in his life has created this sense of unrest, this sense of disquiet and discontent, this sense that there's a better life than the life he's known is possible. So the way we can abstract that is to say that category is that the hunter wants a better life. So blank one is, I want a better life. As the story kind of unfolds, and it wavers, we'll talk about this, how the desires can shift and morph and transform over the course of the story. But the second one is, I want my old life back. So in a different sort of sense, and often this is the case in a stranger comes to town type of stories, the stranger comes in, again, whether that's a literal stranger or some figurative thing that represents the stranger, and upsets the order, upsets the stability, upsets the sense that all is well, and the character's struggle is a struggle to try to recover something of what he or she has lost, that lost life. So we'll come back to Hunter's wife, but I can mention Shrek here. There's a lot more we can say about all of this, but in the interest of maybe some sense of brevity, I'll say that in the beginning of Shrek, you see that Lord Farquaad has issued this decree that they're going to round up all the fairy tale things and really who are mucking up his perfect kingdom, his perfect world, and they're going to put them all together on this, what they call a designated resettlement facility. Kind of invokes the idea of reservations, if you want to think about it like that, where anything that's other, anything that's strange, anything that's anyone who is other or strange or imperfect, according to Farquaad's definition of perfection, which is very narrow and constraining and rigid, must be relocated, right? And of course, in the opening credits, you see this picture of Shrek just living the dream. He has everything just like he wants it. His world is, he's in this swamp, and it's all very, it's all very much to his liking and his taste, even though some of it seems rather disgusting to us as we watch. And so the mice show up, and they're on the table, and the wolf is in the bed, and they put Sleeping Beauty on the table, and you have all of that very humorous unfolding. But just in terms of the narrative, the stranger has come to town in a big way, many strangers, and they've upset the order. And what is it that Shrek wants? He wants his old life back, right? He wants the swamp back. And he's a very active character, to go back to that initial definition. He's an active character. He's going to track down this guy Farquaad and get them all off his land and get his swamp back, right? His old life back. And again, it's a very different type of story, but in a similar sense to what we see in The Hunter's Wife, as the story unfolds, as he goes, first of all, he goes and he confronts Lord Farquaad, as you all know, and Lord Farquaad kind of changes the terms of the narrative, right? So he sends him on, so that's a quest, right? His quest is to get the swamp back, and then Lord Farquaad sends him out to rescue Princess Fiona. And then as they interact, you see his desire begin to shift. And he really fights that. There's this internal conflict that goes on. He really resists making himself vulnerable, making himself open to the possibility of not his old life back, but a better life, which is a life of community and connection, a life where there's love, where he's not just sort of isolated and alone on his swamp. And we could, I wish I was more technological. It'd be fun to kind of run through some clips of this, but there's this wonderful scene where Donkey, they're looking at the moon, and Donkey's basically sort of psychoanalyzing him about being, like, he calls him Onion Boy, and he's asked why he's blocking and why he won't let anybody in and why he's guarding him. Shrek finally sort of has this what I think a psychologist or a counselor might call a breakthrough moment, where he says, everyone, okay, everyone, they judge me before they even know me. And so you get that sense that behind the facade of sort of his Hakuna Matata contentment that you see in that opening scene or montage where he's, preparing for the day, and as the opening credits roll, there's a deeper longing, one that he hadn't even acknowledged himself. And so as he, even as he is this, he's embarking on a journey, on a quest. As he encounters Princess Fiona, the idea of the possibility of that love and real connection, and also in a different, much more humorous sense, the unfolding of the relationship dynamic with Donkey too, that becomes, in a more metaphorical or figurative sense, a stranger kind of coming in, breaking into his town. So as we look at these, like, okay, there's kind of binary, right? There are two types of stories, and there are two categories of desire. There's a lot of overlap and intersection. And so I'll just kind of, I'm glad I have this worksheet because it does keep me focused. So let me say that narrative conflict does not equal problems. That's the next blank. And that's something that I struggle with in my own writing, my own work, and I see a lot in student writing, is that we just imagine a character who has lots and lots of problems, and we think, well, that makes for an interesting story. And the reason for that was not far off. That's a partial truth, right? The problems that a character faces, like the intrusion of Lord Farquaad in The Hunter's Wife, the fact that Mary Roberts is too young, so there's this kind of waiting period of 3 years, and then she's not so agreeable at first. She kind of resists the pursuit by the hunter, and then of course there's a deeper plunge into much more interesting complexities after he has obtained her, for lack of a better word. He's acquired the sort of object of his goal, where he kind of runs this analogy of, like, he thought it was going to be like hunting, right? But with hunting, there's a sort of climactic moment where you take the thing you've hunted, and then that's the end, right? Everything after that is just easy. But actually, when he gets what he wants, what he thought he wanted and did want intensely, that actually leads to a whole other set of complications and issues, because that is a human being with her own concerns and desires and so on. I'm gonna stop sharing briefly and okay, so I had to, it's an odd break, but I had to stop because my battery's dying. So all of that would amount to problems, right? The character has problems with, but that's not enough. So what makes for a conflict in narrative fiction or nonfiction in life is this tension, and I wrote it out as kind of a formula on that sheet, that worksheet, between the desire and the impediment, the desire and the obstacles. And there are other ways of thinking about this. I think Janet Burway, I'm not sure if she developed this, has sort of the 3Ds. Desire plus danger equals drama. Somebody else phrases it slightly different. Intense passion plus monumental obstacle equals story. So you have these kind of formulaic things, but of course that's just a framework. It doesn't mean that we're going to write formulaic stories. Again, we can kind of plug all that into what Doerr's doing in The Hunter's Wife, or what the writer and writers of Shrek are doing in that story, and you get the same kind of. It sort of checks those boxes, but it's anything but formulaic. And in fact, in both cases, again, very different. They're really working against the form. So Shrek's kind of, even as it's this beautiful story, love story and friendship story and quest story and adventure in its own right, and has all this wonderful comedy, it's also, there's a sort of overarching theme of kind of satirizing the sort of sterilization of this sort of sterilization of myth and fairy tale that we get in Disney movies as a general rule. That's probably not always true. So if you look at this in terms of how that escalation occurs. So if you're looking at that sheet and you've got that check mark, you see there's this sort of, it's an upward slope, right? That's often referred to as the rising action. And that's a fine term, but I'd like to think in terms of escalation or intensification, because I do think that as the story unfolds, the conflict needs to get more and more, intense for it to hold our interest. So in The Hunter's Wife, you see that one of the things is that negative capability is you have at the heart of the story, there's a question about what constitutes reality. And so the hunter would have what we might call, if we were going to really abstract this, as naturalistic or scientific worldview. And his wife is very much in tune and in touch with as another dimension, a spiritual dimension of reality. And so he thinks it's a bunch of hocus pocus. For her, it's actually a deeper, more profound, a deeper reality. And so that comes into conflict, right? That helps to escalate. But there's the sort of open and move where we kind of enter what feels almost like a fairy tale space, where he shows her the grizzly bear hibernating, and she goes and puts her hands on it, and she sort of kind of has that flash. I kind of like to imagine how I would film that if I were a filmmaker, where she's sort of seeing his dreams. He's dreaming of summer. He's dreaming of this flowing brook and pursuing, like, hunting, eating berries and things. And then then she kind of connects with something that's not living but dead, and she also connects with that dream. And then later in this story, and you see that several times, and every time she talks about it, at first it's kind of a quaint thing, and the hunter's kind of resistant to it, but it's not a big deal, and then it grows and grows, and then it comes to this point where she is in touch with a human being his truck, I forget his name, but his truck has gone into the river, and he's drowned or died in the accident, and not intentionally, but just in the course of trying to be a good citizen and helping. She connects with him And that really ramps up, that escalates the tension, because there's something in that is much more difficult for the hunter to deny, because there were other people involved. Everybody who was in contact with him, or with him being him, the dead man, or her, kind of felt and saw something of what she felt and saw. So there's that idea. At another way to think about this is, at a basic level, narrative conflicts will involve a pattern of shifting power that kind of unfolds over the course of the story. So as Shrek embarks on his journey, first of all, he's just on a quest to get his swamp back, and as he goes, they encounter certain obstacles along the way. First, it's Lord Farquaad and the men with the crossbows pointed at him, and then later it's the dragon, and dealing with all that, and then the story kind of pivots and becomes about something else, about something more, something deeper. And that's another thing to think about as you write, is that a deeper level, conflicts will involve patterns of disconnection or connection and disconnection. So you have, on one hand, patterns of shifting power, right? The hunter is pursuing his wife, and then he wants that connection, but it's really about sort of who has the upper hand, right? Will she say yes? Will she say no? And then later it becomes about this deeper thing. And I think one way to read that how those two storylines, the two time zones, are interacting and communicating with each other, is that for most of that, the main story, which is that secondary timeline, where it's the relationship unfolding and basically falling apart in the end, right, when she finally leaves. And then there's this 20 years absence, this 20 years of estrangement. That's a story of shifting power. And what's going on in Chicago is the hunter, again, kind of pursuing her in a similar way, but this time it's very different. He's not hunting her. That's much more a story of connection and disconnection. And I think that kind of speaks back to the primary story, which, again, it's a secondary timeline, but I think it's the main story, in a way that helps it to make more sense. So I mentioned also that we talk about the parable of the prodigal son. Again, that's what everybody knows it by, so I use that language. And I'll just mention this briefly because it's so short and concise. One thing you see there is there are three, in that chapter that I asked you to read, it's Luke 15, there are three stories that are threaded together. In the language Luke uses, he actually says he told them this parable, and then it goes through those three. So one way to think about that is that it's one extended parable in three discrete parts. So you have the parable of the sheep and the coin, and then you have the two lost sons, and the father who loves them both. And if you just want to kind of think about this worksheet and how that works, you can think about what they desire. The younger son wants a better life, right? The father's house, the known world, has, for whatever reason, we're not told, it's a parable and it's really spare, has become too confining and too rigid for him. So he asks for his inheritance and he sets out. So he's a stranger. He's a person embarking on a journey. As his story unfolds, as that experiment or exploration goes south for him, his desire changes. He comes to himself, as the language of the parable says. He realizes how lost he is, and his desire for a better life shifts, and he desires his old life back. And so he retraces his steps, and from the perspective of the older brother at that point, he becomes the stranger who comes to town, right? So it kind of is both and, in a sense. and the story really changes. So the father, of course, embraces him, and you have this happy ending, right? He's invited into the feast, and they're gonna celebrate and kill the fatted calf and all that. But from the elder brother's point of view, this is a major disruption, and he's not happy about it. In fact, he's furious, and he really confronts the father. The language in that section is very harsh and hostile, where he basically says, in one translation, "Look, this is not fair. You shouldn't, this son, So there's all this disruption to him, and one of so it's sort of both. And I just wanted you to think about that, because it's so ingeniously structured in such an economical way, as Jesus tells that story to this crowd. And what I think is really fascinating about that, and we'll kind of land here and talk a little bit about how endings work, is that Jesus ends the first one on a very happy note, right? He ends the younger brother's story with a big feast. But the elder brother's story, he actually doesn't end that, right? He leaves that with a sort of ellipsis or a question, right? Will he come in, or will he stay out in his sort of bitterness and hostility in the field? Will he be lost? And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of loops back to where we started, which is the idea that one sort of overarching thesis or theory I have is that we love stories, we tell them, and we listen to them so compulsively because our lives do consist of them. And I do think that in that moment, Jesus is inviting his primary hearers into the story and basically asking them to supply the ending. He's putting them inside the context of the story. And so we'll talk more about all this, but I want you to think about there are three basic ways that a story can end. And this is true for either of those narrative types, right? The shifting power or the connection and disconnection. And those are not, again, that's not an either or. Often it can be both and. But you can have a win. And that's where, if in the sort of understanding of a character's desire, that's what we would call often a happy ending, or a comedy where the character gets what he or she wants. And there's this kind of sense, even though it's often oversimplified or even satirized, that they lived happily ever after. And then there's a loss, right? That's more of a tragic ending. The character doesn't get what he or she wants. And the story ends kind of on a sad or tragic note. And then there's a draw, right? Like a tie, where the ending's not definitive, it's not conclusive. Often this is, you can find some version or variation of this in what we'll call literary fiction or artistic narrative, where there's a sense that the question hasn't been fully or finally settled in the sense of a tragedy, but it also hasn't been completely settled on the positive end, right? Maybe, and I think there's something like that going on in The Hunter's Wife. I think if you were having to sort of tilt, you'd say that's a win, because they do seem to be finally connecting in the end when he sort of moves toward her with understanding and takes her hand. Shrek, of course, ends with the marriage and the happy ending. But if you're familiar with the sort of saga of movies that follow, that's also kind of a draw in the sense that it leads to all these other questions and complications about what this new reality is going to involve or imply for the characters, how it's going to affect them moving forward. And finally, in the prodigal, that parable of the father and his two lost sons, we'll call it, you have, on one hand, you have a happy ending, but then on the other hand, you have just an open-ended ending. And that's something that's, again, something to think about. So I think I'll end the video here. There's so much more I could say, but this feels like it's going long, and I don't want to wear you out with that. But think about it. Think about questions that this raises, and I will see you soon.